Good morning. So today's class is all about counterculture movement, but before that let me just recap what we were doing yesterday. So can anyone tell me what we were doing yesterday? Brando, Dean and Elvis Presley, heroes of the 50s, and what were our observations on the heroes of the 50s, because see, it's all leading towards something, the way these classes are structured. So yesterday we talked about the 50s heroes who were essentially,
they were not hyper masculine.
Okay, not hyper masculine. They were also, what kind of work did James Dean do? What 3 movies, and they were all about method acting. Yes, that's the kind of acting, but what were the thematic thread that runs through his work? About the youth and anti-establishment. Did we talk about that? Yeah, Rebel Without a Cause, the title itself says a lot about the theme of the movie. And then we had also seen that it was based on a book. The title itself derives from a book. And that brings us to counterculture movement. Now, how many of you are aware of counterculture movement? Do you know anything about counterculture movement?
It's about rebellism against the government.
Rebellion against not just the government. Yes, Vietnam was one of the factors, politics was one of the factors, but yes, so this generation was anti-war. This you have to remember. So please take down the key concepts. Very soon you will be doing your quizzes, assignments, etc. So you ought to understand what these people were all about. Anti-Vietnam War. So they did not support the war, in other words, this generation. Hippie culture is also associated with that. Now these are the key concepts. The beat generation, Woodstock nation, and anti-Vietnam war. People who assembled that in August 1969. Okay, so collectively as a group they came to be known as the hippies. And many of the directors that we are going to talk about, especially the new Hollywood directors, they were a part of that. They had actually participated in Woodstock. So my scholar Vimal has been working on new Hollywood cinema for quite a while, and he will give you some description, especially the movie Woodstock.
So hi, this short presentation is going to be a briefing and probably an add-on to what we've been doing in the past couple of classes regarding the countercultural movement in the late 60s and so forth. So the 60s, as we call it, the swinging 60s, and it's important for a lot of radical cultural phenomena and breakthroughs that happened at that point of time, including the civil rights movement, Stonewall riots, and of course Woodstock. So this presentation is going to deal with a little bit of the history of the phenomenon that was Woodstock, and also as you can see, this film that was based on the festival itself, Woodstock, 3 Days of Peace and Music, directed by Michael Wadley. So the festival itself was set up by happened in August 1969, and it was set up by a couple of entrepreneurs who wanted to bring in the biggest musicians of the time into a big festival of sorts. And this happened right outside New York on the farm of a man called Max Yasgur, and it was a huge phenomenon, completely unanticipated in scope and scale, and it happened on a 600-acre farm. The funny thing is that the kind of people that turned out for the festival, little under 500,000 fans and hippies turned out for the festival, and it was completely unprecedented. No one could estimate the number of people who turn up, so it was a big disaster in terms of logistics and management. So there are accounts of this being a big flop show, because the media received the festival initially along very harsh lines, calling it a hippie festival, and hippies are rolling in the mud, considering that it was raining heavily at the farm at that time. And there are reports included among the documents in the film that relate that there were at least 2 deaths happening during the period of the festival, which ran for 3 days. understandably from one from a drug overdose and one from a tractor being run over, a hippie who was sleeping in the farm. So, but so what we had in Max Yasgur's farm in 1969 was basically a city that was formed of free-spirited thinkers and people who didn't care about the establishment or its authoritarian values, and all the laws that determined this community or the lack of it was basically decided by the spirit of the community. So the event was largely and remarkably peaceful considering the number of people who turned out for the festival, and there were performances by the leading musicians of the time, including performances by Richie Havens, Canned Heat, Santana, Crosby, and of course the legendary Jimi Hendrix. And the instance of Hendrix performing for a 2-hour set and his psychedelic rendition of the Star Spangled Banner, which happens to be the national anthem of the United States, is a very iconic moment. And because the song becomes the rendition of the remix, if you may, of the American national anthem, and Hendrix's rendition of it becomes a part of the zeitgeist of the 60s, and it could capture very well what no words can. And the picture of Hendrix performing this song in his white leather jacket and the red headscarf becomes the iconic image that defined the 60s, the swinging 60s. However, unfortunately, Max Yasgur, immediately after the 4 days of celebration got over, he said that he didn't want to do any more of this thing, and he wanted to get back to farming. So that was the last of Woodstock. We didn't have any more of Woodstock happening after that. And he himself captured the philosophy of Woodstock in these lines, quote, "If we join them, we can turn those adversities that are the problem of America today into a hope for a brighter and more peaceful future." And Woodstock also needs to be studied and analyzed in comparison to other cultural phenomena and rock concerts happening at that point of time, including this, including the concert by Rolling Stones, which turned violent and was later captured by David and Albert Maysles in Gimme Shelter, which came out just the same year as Woodstock did in 1970. So together all these films illustrate the influence of counterculture on the younger generation, and they reflected the strength of the youth movement that captured America at that point. Woodstock was also noticeably devoid of a lot of major celebrities, including Bob Dylan, literally in whose backyard Woodstock was taking place. Bob Dylan didn't want to be a part of Woodstock for some reason, and he decided to leave for England the same day that Woodstock festival began. It was also noticeable by the conspicuous absence of the Beatles, and a conspiracy theory goes that the Beatles were denied entry by the then president Richard Nixon. And the other noticeable group that was conspicuously absent was the Doors. But despite all this, Woodstock turned out to be this huge cultural phenomena that has to be remembered every time we talk of the swinging 60s. Now the film itself, Woodstock 3 Days of Peace and Music, directed by Michael Wardley, is a part of what we know today as a concert film. A concert film is a film that records a concert, a live performance, or a band of musicians, or a band, or maybe even it can also it's a blanket term that can even envelop a performance by perhaps a stand-up comedian. Concert films are edited over the course of many performances and are staged with multiple cameras, and then the film is spliced together, and they can be considered to be a pseudo documentary, a quasi documentary, and some people go to the length of calling it as a rockumentary. This particular film under consideration provided a definitive look at the 3-day countercultural rock concert which was held in upstate New York, and along with other prominent rock concert films to come out during the generation were number one, Let It Be, which came out in 1970 to basically filming the last get together of the Beatles, as well as the film that we just talked about, Gimme Shelter, which was notorious for deploying Hell's Angels as security, and which saw the murder of a black man as the Rolling Stones were performing live on stage. This film it's important along many lines, and notably because it subverts the rock concert energy that you normally associate with a film about rock music and a show of this kind. In one of the most memorable sequences of the film, as the film opens, we have canned heats serenely propulsive going up the country, flooding the open farm, and we see herds of hippies walking up the field in upstate New York, forming a tide and gathering onto a big fleet. This is soon this is spliced with an image of hippies dancing and swaying against the twilight sky, which kind of gives out an impression of the hippies invading the Garden of Eden. So as a documentary, Woodstock aims to do two prominent things. Number one, to record and document this huge phenomena, and number two, to provide a social comment on America, in particular the ongoing trouble that they had with Vietnam at that point of time, and using the festival as a sort of antithesis to the society as they saw it. It's also permeated with images, with radical and iconic images of people of religion. We have Swamijis from California and nuns all flashing the peace sign to the camera. Cops on the scene eating popsicles, and the army dropping blankets, food and flowers from their helicopters. The film was edited by Thelma Schoonmaker and, most interestingly, Martin Scorsese, and was released in 1970. The history behind the making of the film is quite an event in itself, because R.T. Cornfield is who was one of the promoters of the festival, approached a lot of Hollywood producers in an attempt to get financing to document the festival, and he was turned down by a lot of them. And finally he knocks on Fox's doors, on Warner Brothers, where Fred Weintraub, he was an executive there, promised to give him $100,000 to make the film. And ironically, Woodstock in fact helped to save Warner Brothers at the time when the company was on the verge of going out of business, and when they made the film they had no idea that the film was going to be such a as phenomenal as the festival itself, because when Wadley went on to gather 100 New Yorkers to shoot for the film, he made a deal with them which was a double or nothing deal, because he had absolutely no idea that the film was going to do so good. He said that if the film would do well, he was going to pay his crew double, or if the film bombed, he was not going to pay them anything at all. So the director, since he uses 16 cameras to capture the festival itself, and which becomes instantly very different from the classic kind of a concert film that in which you would probably find the camera straining on the performers themselves. But because the film was shot extensively with 16 cameras and 100 crew members, the editors had to deal with over 120 miles of filmed footage, which meant that they could be very creative with the way the film actually came out. There could be reaction shots, and the film is also radical because it uses split screens to show multiple perspectives on the same phenomenon happening on stage. Roger Ebert famously remarked that it gives us maybe 60% music and 40% on the people who were there, and I think that's a good ratio.
Thank you, Vimal, for a very nice presentation. So culturally an important era, something that influenced the next decade of filmmaking, because these were the directors who were radically opposed to the prevailing system, prevailing values of the Hollywood that was existing then, and counterculture marked the watershed period in American history, politics and culture. Key people: Jack Kerouac, what did he write? On the Road. Allen Ginsberg, Howl. Okay, that's like a war cry against the establishment. William Burroughs, The Naked Lunch. So that is counterculture movement. And of course, the most important movie of that period was Easy Riders by Dennis Hopper and Peter Fonda. That's important to remember. But the movement also started in cinema, at least. The counterculture movement started with a very famous movie called A Hard Day's Night, starring the Beatles as themselves, directed by Richard Lester. And if you have been following the classes, and if you have been, we have been talking about what classic Hollywood was all about, we have been touching upon what new Hollywood was all about, and we also know what French New Wave cinema was all about, right? Now, just watch a clipping from Beatles' Hard Day's Night and then recall all your classes, recall whatever we have been doing so far. It's 1964. Remember, this was also the period when people were making turkeys like Cleopatra. 20th Century Fox almost ruined itself while making Cleopatra, which was a critical commercial disaster. But why do you think this movie made it so big? It's all about Beatles playing themselves. So you have Paul and Ringo and George and John, and they are just being their natural selves. What are they doing? What's happening here?
Beatlemania.
A Beatlemania captured, okay. So what are we talking about? We are talking about a different kind of hero. Okay, and they are not heroic heroes. They are just playing themselves. Boys next door. Okay, ordinary regular boys from Liverpool who made it big, and they are just being themselves. So absolutely unstarry. It doesn't. Yeah, Beatlemania, yes. But when you see, when you walk with them, when you go, it's a road movie. That's also important. Remember, this is the period when cinema started coming out of the studios. So we no longer had. So you won't find sets here. It's not about sets. It's all about shooting on locations. There are beautiful set pieces in this film which are absolutely shot on locations. Handheld camera, otherwise how will you capture Beatles being chased by millions of fans on streets? Okay, so cinema came out on the streets and equipment got lighter and lighter, as opposed to those cameras which studios or DOPs, director of photography, would put on tripods, heavy cameras, etc. So what did it do to filmmaking? A freedom, a liberation, and also led to democratization of cinema. Okay, so we often use the word democratization, how social networking sites have brought about a huge change in our socio-cultural scenario. Democratization, everyone has the right to express opinions. Now, Richard Lester here showed us that anyone can make a film provided they have the right attitude. This movie also doesn't have a screenplay. We were talking about classic Hollywood cinema following a what structure? 3-act structure: exposition, climax, denouement. Here you won't find it. It's absolutely episodic. Yeah, unheroic heroes. That's what we were talking about yesterday. Unheroic heroes. Okay, studio shot on location, and also people who were young. Heroes, actors who are very young. They were all in their early 20s. Grandfather is repeatedly ridiculed and made fun of, and is always referred to as he's very clean, whatever that means. Yeah, and he has to take it. Yeah, all the jokes are very, in your face. They make cheeky retorts at everyone, their manager, even the police. There is a beautiful scene where they are all put behind the bars for creating lot of disturbance on the streets, and the way then they handle the situation. Okay, so extremely anti-authoritarian and anti-establishment marked the Beatles when they were at their peak. Yeah, and it has all the beautiful song, but it's not an Elvis Presley vehicle. Now there is a difference. Elvis Presley in the 50s would repeatedly star in movies which capitalized only on his music. So after every 1 minute you will have a song, because we know that this is what the people wanted, and the plots are very flimsy. Okay, unwatchable movies, barring 1 or 2 film. Most of the Elvis vehicles were extremely unwatchable, but this is a movie which takes stardom with a bag of salt. Okay, they are absolutely unconscious about their stardom. They don't take it seriously, and that attitude shows. Okay, so that's what marked the new Hollywood, the new wave cinema. So we were talking about counterculture, and this is the background. So there is this novel called Junkie by William Burroughs, who was a known addict, and we are told that many of his great novels, which have today become like Bibles of counterculture movement, they were written under the influence. So he was one of the earliest literature of protest and anti-establishment. Most of his works, Junkie is one of his earliest known works, and then it came on the heels of Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, which is again a very protest kind of a novel against establishment and authority. Another important book, 1956, Allen Ginsberg, Howl, and it begins famously with the well-known lines, "I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked." Okay, so that's a howl, that's a protest literature, and protest against what? Tyrannical tendencies of post-war America, its gross and blatant commercialization, and intolerance towards the marginalized people, people who are on the fringes of society. On the Road by Kerouac, 1957, and it's a very important work because it marks that, it tells you that real America is not centered on a few major cities where the rich dwell, but in order to understand the country you have to be on the road. And it was based on story of Dean Moriarty and Sal Paradise in 1947. Has anyone read this book in this class? You have. Okay.
I think they made a movie on this recently.
A recent movie, yeah. It's a very unfilmable book, let me tell you. So it's just like Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas by Hunter S. Thompson. Yeah, so the earlier one did pretty well with Johnny Depp and Benicio del Toro, but the recent one, Rum Diary, the Rum Diary, again by Hunter S. Thompson, and again with Johnny Depp. They were very close. Hunter Thompson and Johnny Depp, they were very close friends. So therefore, Johnny Depp must have felt obligated to star in the movie, but it didn't do well at all.